Two people made a wrong turn. That is how it started. Not with a grand declaration of war. Not with centuries of planning finally reaching their moment. With two broke, desperate siblings making a blind hyperspace jump and landing in the worst possible place, at the worst possible time, in front of the worst possible people. Their names were Gav and Jory Daragon. They were hyperspace scouts. They were deeply in debt, and within hours of landing on a world they had never heard of, they had triggered a chain of events that would kill millions. The war that followed would be called the Great Hyperspace War, and the galaxy never saw it coming. That is the thing no one fully reckons with. 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy woke up one morning and discovered that something enormous and ancient and furious had been living in the dark right next to it for over 1,000 years. Not hiding in some remote corner of the outer reaches, right there, close enough to strike at Coruscant, close enough to hit the capital of the Republic with a fleet so large and so sophisticated that the first question wasn't whether the Republic could win. It was whether the Republic could survive. The answer was not obvious. Not at first. Not for a long time. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what was waiting in that dark. Not the Sith of myth or legend, the real thing. A civilization that had been growing in total secrecy for over a millennium, that had spent every one of those years becoming more dangerous. And that was, at the exact moment, two lost explorers accidentally knocked on its door, right on the edge of tearing itself apart over a question of who got to lead it into war. The timing could not have been worse. Or, depending on whose side you were on, it could not have been better. There is a version of history that the Republic told itself for a very long time. In that version, the Sith were a cautionary tale, a mistake, a wrong turn that had been corrected, sealed off, filed away into the deeper archives of the Jedi Temple where only the most senior masters were ever permitted to look. In that version, the darkness had been dealt with. The danger was behind them. The galaxy was safe, expanding, prospering, and at peace. That version was a lie, not a deliberate one, not a conspiracy or a cover-up. Simply the kind of comfortable story that civilizations tell themselves when they cannot bear to look too closely at what they do not yet understand. The truth was something older than the Republic, something patient. Something that had been sitting in the dark between the stars for over 1,000 years, building, waiting, perfecting itself in secret while the rest of the galaxy forgot it existed. That truth had a name. It had temples and cities and a language, and a philosophy and an empire. It had lords who commanded fleets and sorcerers who could reach into living minds and twist what they found there. It had warriors who had spent centuries sharpening themselves into weapons. And at the center of all of it, at the heart of a civilization that the Republic had no idea still breathed, there was a world called Ziost. Ziost was cold. Not the cold of winter, not the seasonal cold of a planet tilting away from its sun. The cold of Ziost was something the dark side had made permanent. A deep, still, bone-aching cold that pressed against everything, that settled into the stones of the ancient buildings and refused to leave, that made the air itself feel heavy and deliberate, as though the atmosphere were holding its breath. The sky over Ziost was the color of a bruise, low and constant and layered. And beneath it, the capital of the Sith Empire rose in angular black towers that caught no warmth from the distant sun and radiated none of their own. This was where the Sith had built their throne, not on Korriban, though Korriban was sacred to them in ways that went deeper than politics, deeper than governance, deeper than any practical consideration of strategy or geography. Korriban was the place where the Sith buried their greatest dead, where the Valley of the Dark Lords cut between ancient red cliffs and the tombs of emperors lay sealed inside the rock, their power still radiating outward through the Force long after the bodies inside had turned to dust. Korriban was the soul of the Sith Empire. Ziost was its mind. To understand what happened when those two lost hyperspace explorers stumbled into Sith territory, you have to understand what they stumbled into. Not the Sith of legend, not the abstract darkness that the Jedi warned their students about. The real thing. A civilization that had been growing in the shadows of the outer reaches for more than a millennium, that had developed its own culture and art and science and philosophy alongside its mastery of the dark side of the Force, and that had spent every year of that millennium becoming more dangerous, more capable, and more ready. It had not always been there. Everything has a beginning, and the Sith Empire that sat waiting on the far edge of known space had been born out of catastrophe, out of war and exile and the kind of humiliation that certain kinds of people never forgive and never forget. Long before the Great Hyperspace War, there had been a conflict that the history books of the Republic called the 100-Year Darkness. A group of Jedi had broken from the Order over the question of whether the dark side could be used without corrupting its user. Their position was that it could. The Order's position was that they were wrong. What followed was a century of war, and the Order ultimately prevailed. The surviving Dark Jedi leaders were not executed. They were exiled, placed on ships, and sent out beyond the edges of mapped space with no way home and no welcome if they found one. The Republic and the Jedi Order both considered this mercy. It was not mercy. It was a mistake whose full consequences would take over 1,000 years to arrive, because the exiled Dark Jedi did not simply drift into space and fade away. They found a world already inhabited by a species whose culture and biology and very nature made them uniquely suited to receive these fallen warriors. A species called the Sith, red-skinned and Force-sensitive, who had developed their own relationship with the dark side of the Force long before any human or near-human had ever walked among them. The Dark Jedi encountered the Sith and recognized in them something they understood. Power. Ancient power. Undisciplined by Jedi. Training but vast in its depth, woven into the very bones of the species. What happened next was not a conquest. Exactly. Though the Dark Jedi were certainly capable of conquest. What happened was something stranger and more complete. The Dark Jedi became gods to the Sith people. They brought technology and training and a refined understanding of the Force that the native Sith had never possessed. And the native Sith responded with a reverence and a loyalty that the Dark Jedi had never experienced in the Order they had left behind. Over generations, the two populations intertwined. The descendants of the Dark Jedi took Sith names and Sith customs. The native Sith took on the philosophies and fighting styles of the fallen warriors. The bloodlines merged until it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. And from that merging, something new was born. The Sith Empire. For 1,000 years, this empire grew in the darkness beyond the Republic's furthest borders. It expanded planet by planet, absorbing systems that the Republic had never charted and would never know existed. It developed a culture of extraordinary depth and a darkness of extraordinary power. The Sith Lords who ruled over it were not simple tyrants. They were scholars of the Force who had spent generations exploring aspects of its power that the Jedi Order had declared forbidden, and they had found things in that darkness that the Order had never imagined and would have been terrified to encounter. Sith alchemy, battle meditation, the art of binding the Force itself to physical matter, of creating life and warping it to serve, of reaching into the minds of enemies and breaking them from the inside. These were not myths. These were disciplines that the Sith had spent centuries mastering, and they had become very good at all of them. But a civilization of the Sith, left to itself with no external pressure, no shared enemy, and no common cause, tends toward a particular kind of instability. Ambition is the engine of everything the Sith believe. And ambition does not naturally settle into peace. The history of the Sith Empire in the centuries before the Great Hyperspace War was a history of constant internal competition. Sith lords maneuvering against each other, forming alliances and betraying them, testing limits and punishing weakness. 1,000 small wars within the larger structure of the empire, kept in check not by law or ideology, but by the will of whoever sat at the top. And for the century before everything changed, the person who sat at the top was Marka Ragnos. If you could choose a single moment to enter the story of the Great Hyperspace War and try to understand it fully, you might choose to enter here, not with the invasion fleets, or the battles, or the burning cities. Here, in the long quiet of Ragnos's reign, before anything had gone wrong yet, before the first wrong turn had been made, because everything that happened after was shaped by what Ragnos built, and everything that fell apart did so in the space he had once held together by sheer force of will. Marka Ragnos was not young when he ruled the Sith Empire. He had not been young for a very long time. He was old in the way that the most dangerous things are old, not diminished but concentrated, refined down to an essence so dense and so potent that it barely needed to exert itself anymore. He had ruled for over a century, which in the context of Sith history was essentially a geological feature. Sith lords did not generally survive long enough to die of old age. They were killed by rivals, by apprentices, by the slow erosion of enemies who had been waiting patiently for the right moment. That Ragnos had outlasted all of them was not luck. It was design. The secret of Ragnos's longevity was something that was almost antithetical to everything the Sith professed to believe. The Sith taught that power was everything, that strength was the only virtue that mattered, that the weak existed to serve the strong, and the strong existed to dominate. Ragnos believed all of that, but he had also understood something that his rivals and his predecessors had consistently failed to grasp. The most dangerous threat to a powerful Sith Lord was never an enemy from outside. It was always the ambitious subordinate who had learned enough, grown strong enough, and decided that the time had finally come. So Ragnos did not suppress ambition among his Sith Lords. He channeled it. He created conditions in which the most dangerous and capable Sith beneath him were always occupied fighting each other. He would elevate one rival just far enough to threaten another, then stand back and watch as the two of them consumed each other's attention and energy. He rewarded those who succeeded without becoming too powerful, and he eliminated those who began to think that they might be ready to challenge him directly. It was governance as performance, empire as a living system of controlled instability. And for over 100 years, It worked perfectly. Under the reign of Marka Ragnos, the Sith Empire reached what later historians would call its golden age. The territories under Sith control expanded. The dark arts advanced. The military grew larger and more capable. The culture deepened. Great structures rose on Ziost and on Korriban, and on the other worlds of the Sith core. The Valley of the Dark Lords received new tombs as old lords died and were honored in death with the elaborate burial rites that Sith tradition demanded. Trade moved through Sith space with something approaching regularity. Even the constant low-level conflict among Sith lords served a purpose, keeping the military sharp and the ambitious occupied, preventing the stagnation that too much peace tends to produce. None of this was accidental. Ragnos shaped it all, sometimes directly, more often through the careful application of influence and suggestion from a distance. He knew the names of every significant Sith Lord in his empire, knew their ambitions and their weaknesses, and the specific texture of their relationship with the dark side. He knew which rivalries to encourage and which to allow to burn themselves out. He knew when to act and, perhaps more importantly, he knew when to wait. He was not loved. The Sith do not generally love their rulers. He was feared, which is more useful, and he was respected, which is rarer. Even his most dangerous rivals understood that Ragnos was something exceptional, a mind that operated on a level that most Sith could admire, even if they resented it. The spirit of Marka Ragnos, which would later make its presence felt at his own funeral, was not something that dissipated easily. It was the spirit of a being who had spent more than a century perfecting the art of surviving in the most dangerous political environment in the galaxy. And then, as all things must, it ended. The precise circumstances of Ragnos's death have been the subject of considerable speculation. He was old. He had been old for a very long time. The dark side extends life in ways that conventional medicine cannot, but it does not grant immortality, not without costs that Ragnos had apparently chosen not to pay. Whatever the cause, the fact of it was simple. Marka Ragnos died, and when he did, the entire structure he had spent a century constructing, the careful web of tensions and balances and controlled rivalries that had kept the empire stable through sheer architectural genius, immediately began to unravel, because Ragnos had never named a successor. This was almost certainly deliberate. A named successor was a target. It was a declaration to every ambitious Sith Lord in the Empire that here was the person they needed to destroy in order to claim the throne. Ragnos had avoided creating that target throughout his reign. But the consequence was that when he died, there was no clear line of succession, no agreed-upon heir, no mechanism for an orderly transfer of power. There was only the vacuum he left behind. And into that vacuum, every Sith Lord with sufficient power and ambition immediately began to move. Two of them moved faster than the others and with enough force to quickly establish themselves as the primary contenders for the throne. The first was Naga Sado. The second was Ludo Kresh. They were not alike in almost any meaningful way, and the fact that they had both arrived at the moment of Ragnos's death with the resources and the will to fight for his throne was perhaps the most perfect possible illustration of how different two things can be while still wanting exactly the same thing. Ludo Kresh was a traditionalist in the deepest sense of that word. He believed in the Sith Empire as it existed, as it had always existed, as a civilization defined by its isolation and its patience. The Republic was out there, beyond the borders, vast and militarily powerful, and essentially unaware that the Sith existed. Kresh believed this was the correct state of affairs. The Sith Empire had grown strong in secrecy. It had perfected its arts without interference. Any contact with the Republic carried risks that he considered unacceptable. The Republic had its Jedi Order. And the Jedi Order was not something to engage with carelessly. Kresh had studied the history of the Dark Jedi, who had been exiled a millennium ago. He knew how that exile had come about. He had no intention of repeating it. Naga Sado was something else entirely. He was ambitious with a quality that went beyond personal advancement, beyond the ordinary Sith hunger for power over rivals and subordinates. Sado wanted more than the Sith Empire had. He wanted more than any Sith Lord before him had tried to claim. He looked at the maps of known space, and he saw the Republic with all of its worlds and all of its resources and all of its population, and he did not see a threat. He saw an opportunity of almost incomprehensible scale. He believed, with the passionate conviction that characterizes a certain kind of dangerous mind, that the Sith Empire was ready to expand, that the dark side had grown strong enough, that the time had come to stop hiding and start claiming what the Sith deserved. Ragnos had kept this ambition in check through the simple expedient of being more powerful than Sadao and making it clear that any premature action would result in consequences. With Ragnos gone, there was nothing left to keep it in check. The funeral of Marka Ragnos took place on Korriban. It could not have taken place anywhere else. Korriban was where the Dark Lords were buried, where the Valley of Dark Lords received its new residents with the elaborate ceremonies that Sith tradition demanded, where the atmosphere of the dead made itself felt in ways that even Force-blind observers sometimes reported as a physical sensation, a pressure behind the eyes, a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The assembled Sith Lords came from across the Empire for the occasion. When a Dark Lord of Ragnos' stature died, attendance was not optional. The ceremony itself was ancient in its form. The body of Ragnos, prepared according to rites that predated even the arrival of the exiled Dark Jedi, was to be interred in a tomb that had been under construction for years, because Ragnos had been old enough and wise enough to plan even this far ahead. The assembled Sith stood in the red dust of the valley between the carved faces of the cliffs, beneath a sky the color of dried blood and the weight of 1,000 years of dark side power pressed down on all of them from the stones around them. It was in this setting, in this place, that Sado and Kresh arrived with their retinues. And it was in this setting that the confrontation that had been building since Ragnos drew his last breath finally had nowhere left to go but forward. Words were exchanged first. Words always come first among the Sith, because words are another weapon, and the Sith use every weapon available to them. Sado made the case for his vision of expansion and conquest, for an empire that would finally take what it had always deserved. Kresh argued for patience and consolidation, for the preservation of what had been built at such cost over so many centuries. Neither was interested in convincing the other. They were performing for the assembled Sith Lords, each one trying to demonstrate that they were the superior choice, the stronger mind, the more worthy ruler. And then the words ran out, as they always do between the Sith and the lightsabers. came out. The duel between Nagasado and Ludo Kresh in the Valley of the Dark Lords at the funeral of Marka Ragnos has been told and retold in Sith oral tradition for generations. Not because of the outcome, which was actually somewhat inconclusive, but because of what interrupted it. Because in the middle of the duel, something happened that no one had been expecting. Not even those who had spent their lives studying the Sith and their relationship with the dark side. The spirit of Marka Ragnos appeared. Not a vision. Not a false impression of the kind that the recently dead sometimes leave behind in places where the Force runs strong. Something more deliberate than that. More present. More intentional. The ghost of the Dark Lord manifested in the space between the two combatants with enough presence and power to make them both stop fighting and take a step back, which tells you something about what kind of entity was looking at them. Ragnos did not give his blessing to either of them. He did not name a successor or resolve the succession crisis in the way that anyone present might have hoped. What he did instead was issue a warning. He told them both that they stood at a moment of significance greater than either of them understood, that the future of the Sith Empire depended on choices that had not yet been made, that greater challenges lay ahead than either of them could currently perceive. And then, having said what he had come to say, the spirit of Marka Ragnos faded back into whatever existed beyond the boundary that death creates. The assembled Sith Lords stood in the red dust and the silence and tried to process what they had just witnessed. It was a moment so strange and so charged with meaning that even hardened Sith warriors found themselves uncertain how to interpret it. A warning about greater challenges. What challenges? From where? The Empire was secure. The Republic did not know they existed. What could possibly be coming that Ragnos, even in death, felt compelled to warn them about? They would not have to wait very long to find out. Garv Daragon had been making mistakes his entire life. This was, according to anyone who knew him, not a matter of intelligence or intention. Gav was smart enough, determined enough, capable enough in many of the ways that mattered for the particular life he had chosen. But he was also unlucky with a consistency that suggested it might be structural rather than circumstantial. And he had a quality that in better circumstances would have been called optimism, but in his actual circumstances more often manifested as a failure to accurately assess risk. His sister Jory was different. Jory was practical and careful, and had a much more realistic understanding of exactly how bad things could get at any given moment. She had spent most of her adult life being the voice in her brother's ear that said, "Wait, think, consider the alternatives." She had not always been listened to. The fact that the two of them were operating at the furthest economic margins of Republic society at the time of their fateful jump, deeply in debt and running short of options, was partly the result of a series of decisions that Jory had opposed and Gav had made anyway. They were hyperspace scouts, or they aspired to be. The actual title implied a level of official backing and professional standing that the Daragon siblings had never quite achieved. What they were, more accurately, was two people with a ship and a working hyperdrive and the knowledge of how to use it, surviving on the margins of an economy that rewarded successful hyperspace exploration generously and punished unsuccessful hyperspace exploration with the kind of debt that compounded faster than most people could run from it. Hyperspace exploration was one of the foundational industries of the Republic in this era. The Republic was still growing, still mapping, still finding new routes that would connect distant systems to the galactic economy and open up previously inaccessible territories for trade and settlement. A good route discovery could make a navigator's fortune. Several good route discoveries could make a dynasty. The promise of that fortune had drawn the Daragons into the profession, as it had drawn many others. And the profession had not been kind to them. Their debts had accumulated the way debts do when income is inconsistent and expenses are not. The ship needed fuel. The ship needed maintenance. They needed to eat. They needed equipment. And the routes they had found had not, so far, been worth very much. Not worthless, but not enough. Never quite enough. By the time of their critical decision, they were in the position of people who have run out of conservative options and are now contemplating the kind of move that they know is reckless, but have convinced themselves has no alternative. The creditors were pressing. The ship's systems were showing the kind of wear that demanded attention they could not afford to give. And the routes that could be safely navigated from their current position were already charted, already competed over, already yielding margins too thin to matter. Jory laid out the situation clearly. Gav listened. And then Gav made the decision that he had probably already made before the conversation started. A blind jump. Hyperspace navigation in this era was not the intuitive art it would eventually become, with the development of more sophisticated Navi computers and the accumulation of thousands of years of charted routes. It was an imprecise and genuinely dangerous practice that required either detailed navigational data or extremely good judgment, preferably both. A blind jump, meaning a jump calculated without sufficient data about the destination, was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. You might emerge in the middle of empty space. You might emerge close enough to a gravity well to be pulled apart before your shields could respond. You might emerge in a region with conditions your ship was not built to handle. Or you might emerge somewhere that no one had ever charted. Somewhere with something in it that no one had ever mapped. Somewhere that turned out to be not empty at all. The last possibility was what Gav was hoping for. The kind of route discovery that only happened when someone was willing to go somewhere the data didn't cover. The kind of discovery that paid enough to clear every debt they had and set them up for years. The jump was calculated. The coordinates were entered. The ship moved into hyperspace. When it emerged, everything was wrong. Not mechanically wrong. The ship was intact. The systems were functional. Nothing about the technical execution of the jump had failed. What was wrong was the location. They had not emerged in empty space. They had not emerged near an uncharted but safe system that they could map and report back. They had emerged in orbit around a world that had clearly already been found by someone else. A world with structures visible from orbit, with technology in evidence, with what appeared to be a civilization of some kind already present and functioning. Korriban. They had emerged at Korriban, right at the edge of the Sith Empire, in the middle of the funeral ceremonies of Marka Ragnos, in the presence of an assembled collection of the most powerful dark side practitioners in the galaxy, at possibly the single worst moment in Sith history to show up uninvited. They landed. They did not have many other options. Their ship was not going to survive another immediate jump without more fuel and more maintenance than they were going to get in deep space. They came down in the red dust of Korriban and stepped out of their ship into a world that felt immediately, viscerally wrong, though neither of them had the vocabulary for what they were sensing. The Force was not something the Daragon siblings consciously perceived. but what it feels like when thousands of dead Sith Lords are buried under the ground beneath your feet. When the air is saturated with the residue of centuries of dark side power is something that registers even without conscious force sensitivity. A pressure, a weight, a sense of being watched by something very old and very patient and very interested in your presence. The Sith were already aware of them. Of course they were. You do not land an unregistered foreign vessel in the middle of a funeral ceremony on the most sacred world in your empire without being noticed immediately. Guards were dispatched. The Daragon siblings were taken into custody before they had gone 50 meters from their ship. In the cells beneath whatever structure had been pressed into service to hold them, Gav and Jory Daragon confronted the practical dimensions of their situation. They were prisoners of a civilization they had not known existed until approximately 1 hour ago. They did not speak the language. They had no way of communicating with the Republic. Their ship was impounded, and the beings who had taken them into custody carried weapons and radiated a quality of power that was different from anything either of them had ever encountered, something beneath the surface of ordinary presence that suggested depth and danger in equal measure. What happened next in the Sith court was a debate about what to do with them. The conservative position was straightforward. These outsiders had arrived in Sith territory. They now knew that the Sith Empire existed. They would have navigation data in their ship's computer that could lead other Republic vessels directly here. The existence of the Empire depended on the Republic's ignorance of it. Therefore, the outsiders had to die. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. This was Ludo Kresh's position, and it was a position that the majority of the assembled Sith Lords found entirely reasonable. But Naga Sado was watching the two prisoners and thinking something different. He was thinking about what they represented, not as individuals, not as a threat to be eliminated, as a resource, as the specific kind of resource that he had been trying to find a way to create for quite some time. Because Sado's problem, as he had been slowly coming to understand it since Ragnos died, was not a shortage of military capability. The Sith Empire had military capability in abundance. His problem was political. He needed a reason to go to war. He needed something that would unite the fractious Sith Lords behind his leadership rather than Kresh's. Something that would override the cautious instincts of the traditionalists and make the case for expansion so compellingly that no one could argue against it. What he needed, in short, was a crisis. And here, dropped into his lap by the randomness of a blind hyperspace jump, was everything he needed to manufacture one. Sado moved carefully. He always moved carefully when the stakes were high enough. He began by arguing in the Sith court that executing the outsiders immediately was premature, that they should first be interrogated, that their ship's navigation systems should be thoroughly examined before any decisions were made. This was reasonable enough on its face that Kresh could not immediately object without appearing to be acting against the Empire's intelligence interests. Behind the scenes, Sado made arrangements. He accessed the Daragon ship's navigational systems himself, personally, under the pretense of conducting the intelligence review he had advocated for. He downloaded what he needed from the Navi computer. He was not done in there. He also placed something of his own in the ship's systems, something that would become important later, something small and undetectable. For now, then he organized the escape. The mechanics of what Sado arranged were elaborate but controlled. False evidence was prepared. A group of Sado's own agents, presented to the broader Sith court as Republic soldiers, staged what appeared to be a rescue operation on behalf of the Daragon siblings. They fought their way into the facility where the prisoners were being held. They moved with the kind of tactical precision that looked genuine because it was. The Daragon siblings, confused and frightened but not in a position to question the details of their own rescue, were hustled back to their ship and launched back toward Republic space. In the chaos of the escape, several Sith guards were killed. Ships were damaged. The whole operation had the texture and the evidence trail of a genuine Republic military action, because Sado had designed it to look exactly like that. By the time Kresh and his faction arrived to assess what had happened, the story was already being told. The Republic had sent soldiers to extract their citizens from Sith captivity. The Republic knew the Sith Empire existed. The Republic was already taking active steps against them. How else to explain what had just happened? What other interpretation was possible? The proof was there in the dead guards and the damaged ships and the empty cell where the prisoners had been. Kresh saw through it. He was not a fool. And the convenience of the timing, the way everything had broken exactly right to support Sado's arguments about the need for war, struck him as too perfect to be coincidental. He pushed back. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial. He said, in the way that people say things when they know what the truth is but cannot prove it, that they should be cautious about drawing large conclusions from limited information. But Sado was ready for this. He had been building toward this moment, and he knew exactly how to use it. He turned Kresh's opposition into evidence of weakness. He told the assembled Sith Lords that Kresh's caution was exactly the kind of timid thinking that had kept the Sith Empire in hiding for 1,000 years. That the Republic had just demonstrated it was already moving against them. That waiting for more evidence was the same as choosing to be caught unprepared. That the strong response, the Sith response, was to act first and to act decisively. The assembled Sith Lords were not all persuaded immediately, but the argument had a momentum to it that Sado was very skilled at nurturing, and Kresh's position, while logically defensible, had the disadvantage of requiring the Sith Lords to believe that the most dramatic evidence they had ever seen of Republic aggression was actually not what it appeared to be. Convincing people to doubt the evidence of their own perception is always harder than convincing them to believe it. Sado pushed his advantage. He moved against Kresh with the kind of decisive speed that the political moment rewarded, and that his own nature inclined him toward. In the confrontation that followed, Kresh's forces were caught unprepared. His flagship was destroyed in an engagement that Sado had orchestrated, and that Sado's forces won cleanly enough that Kresh himself appeared to die in the fighting. Appeared to die. This detail would matter later, though Sado did not know it yet. With his primary rival apparently eliminated, with the argument for war successfully made, with the manufactured crisis of the Republic rescue operation hanging over the assembled court like smoke, Naga Sado was crowned the new Dark Lord of the Sith. He stood in the ancient ceremonies of the coronation and wore the title of Marka Ragnos, and the other Sith Lords bent their knees. And the empire that had been leaderless since Ragnos' death now had its ruler, and that ruler had already decided exactly what he was going to do with it. Far away from Korriban, on the other side of a border that neither side fully understood yet, the Republic went about its business in complete ignorance. The Galactic Republic of 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin was not the institution that later eras would know. It was younger in its assumptions, more confident in its safety, less burdened by the accumulated experience of having survived repeated existential threats from directions it had not anticipated. The civilization that would eventually learn to read the galaxy with the cautiousness of something that has been surprised many times was not yet that. It was still, in some fundamental sense, a civilization that believed it understood the shape of the world it lived in. This was not arrogance, exactly. It was the natural condition of a society that had not recently been wrong about anything large enough to correct the assumption. The Republic was vast and prosperous, and defended by the most capable peacekeeping force in the known galaxy. The Jedi Order had been the guardians of civilization for thousands of years, and in that time they had faced and handled every significant threat that had presented itself. Dark side outbreaks had been contained. Conflicts between member worlds had been resolved. Pirates and warlords and the various other threats that stability generates had been dealt with in due course. The fact that there might be something beyond the borders that the Order's knowledge did not cover was not a thought that occupied most minds in the Republic very often. Among the minds that it did occupy was a Jedi who had arrived at that concern through a path that was unusual even by the standards of a tradition that valued unusual paths. His name was Odan Ur. He was not a human, which was itself notable in an era when the Jedi Order's membership, while diverse, had certain tendencies. He was a Drathos, a species whose biological history had shaped them into beings of long memory and careful thought, with lifespans that stretched far beyond most species and minds that accumulated experience at a rate that made them potentially remarkable scholars and terrible opponents. Odan Ur had been studying the Force and the traditions of the Jedi Order for long enough to have developed opinions that did not always sit comfortably with the mainstream of Jedi thinking. He was not a warrior in the way that the Order's tradition of knighthood celebrated. He was a scholar, a researcher, a being who spent more of his time in the archives than on any battlefield, who believed that understanding was a form of protection more durable than any weapon. His masters had occasionally expressed concern that this made him insufficiently focused on the practical demands of Jedi service. Odan Ur had responded to these concerns with the kind of polite attention that did not change his behavior at all. He had been receiving visions. The Force communicated differently with different practitioners. Some Jedi experienced its guidance as a pressure or a pull, a physical sensation that told them to move this way or stand here or step back. Others heard something they could only describe as a voice, though they understood it was not a voice in the conventional sense. Odan Ur experienced the Force primarily through images, through visions that arrived unannounced, usually during meditation, sometimes during sleep, images that had the texture of memory without the content of anything he had actually experienced. The visions he had been having in the period before the Great Hyperspace War were consistent in their imagery but resistant to clear interpretation. Fire moving through space, darkness arriving in a form he could not quite define, from a direction he could not quite locate. Structures that were not Jedi or Republic structures, built in an architectural language he did not recognize, beneath skies that were not the skies of any world he had visited. The sense, powerful and specific, of something very old and very powerful and very angry beginning to move. He had presented these visions to his superiors. He had been patient about it, as was his nature, presenting the evidence he had in the measured and thorough way that he approached everything. The response he received was not dismissive, exactly. The Jedi Order of this era took Force visions seriously as a matter of principle. But the visions Odan-Ur described were ambiguous in the way that many Force visions are, impressionistic rather than specific, warning of something without being clear about what or when or from where. And the Republic, in this moment, had no obvious threats that might be generating that kind of warning. So the Council listened and considered, and noted the visions in whatever records the Order kept of such things, and returned to the business of governing a civilization at peace. Odan-Ur returned to his research and his meditation, and his visions continued. What he could not have known, what no one in the Republic could have known, was that at the very moment his visions were becoming more insistent and more frequent, the source of what he was sensing was already in motion. The Daragon siblings, guided home by the navigation data their ship contained and pushed along by whatever Sado had placed in their systems, were moving through hyperspace back toward Republic space. Behind them, visible only to the Force, in the way that large and dangerous things moving in the dark sometimes are, the machinery of invasion was beginning to turn. Naga Sado was not an impulsive commander. This is one of the details that tends to be lost in the later retelling of the Great Hyperspace War, which focuses so heavily on the drama and violence of the invasion itself that it sometimes obscures how much careful preparation went into it. Sado was ambitious to a degree that bordered on obsessive, but he was also intelligent, and intelligence told him that ambition without adequate preparation was not conquest. It was suicide. He had the navigation data from the Daragon ship. He knew the route back to Republic space. He knew the existence of the Daragon Trail, the hyperspace path that the siblings had used to reach Sith territory, and that, reversed, would lead directly into the heart of the Republic. This was the foundational piece of the invasion's strategic design, a route that could move his armada from Sith space to Republic space in a time frame that would allow for the coordinated simultaneous strikes he was planning. Because coordination was the key. Sado had studied the Republic's military and political structure with the attention of someone who intends to attack it. And he had identified both its strengths and its vulnerabilities with precision. The Republic's strengths were real and considerable. It had a large military, distributed across many worlds, experienced and well-equipped and supported by the Jedi Order, whose individual members were among the most dangerous fighters and most capable Force users in the galaxy. A conventional military attack against any single target would face Republic forces that had the capacity to respond and the will to do so effectively. But the Republic's very size was also its central vulnerability. To defend everywhere simultaneously was impossible. A force large enough to defend any single important target was necessarily not present at all the other important targets. The Republic's defensive posture was organized around responding to threats as they emerged, moving forces to the point of contact and meeting the enemy there. It was a strategy designed for the kind of threats the Republic had actually faced in its history: the localized conflicts, the border disputes, the piracy that concentrated in particular regions. It was not designed for a simultaneous strike against dozens of worlds at once. That was what Sado was planning. Not a single invasion of a single target, but a coordinated offensive that would strike everywhere at once, that would overload the Republic's ability to respond, that would create so many fires simultaneously that the firefighting capacity of the Republic military and the Jedi Order together would not be sufficient to put all of them out at the same time. He worked through the planning with the thoroughness that the scale of the operation required. Target worlds were selected based on their strategic and symbolic importance. Coruscant, the Republic capital, could not be ignored. It was the heart of the Republic's political system and its symbolic center. And a strike against it would carry a psychological weight beyond the purely military damage. The Koros system, not yet renamed, was a key economic and military node whose disruption would ripple throughout the surrounding region. Kirik was important for reasons both logistical and psychological. For each target, Sado calculated the optimal force allocation. He knew he could not send his entire armada to any single world, because his armada had to be in multiple places simultaneously to achieve the overwhelming effect he needed. This meant that at each individual engagement, his forces would be smaller than the full might of the Sith military. This was where his most significant tactical innovation came in. Sado had developed, or perhaps refined from older Sith practice, a technique of extraordinary power and subtlety. From within a specially constructed vessel called a meditation sphere, he could extend his connection to the Force across enormous distances and use it to create illusions on the battlefield, not mere visual tricks, complete sensory fabrications. Ghost fleets that appeared on sensors and to naked eyes as real warships, that maneuvered with something approaching tactical plausibility, that required defenders to respond to them as though they were real, because there was no way from the receiving end to know they were not. The meditation sphere was built with Sith alchemy woven into its structure, enhancing and extending his natural force capabilities in ways that made the range and scale of the illusions possible. From inside it, Sado could project the appearance of reinforcing fleets across an entire theater of war. He could make a strike force of 50 ships look like 500. He could make a planetary assault force appear to have reserves that didn't exist. He could keep defenders pinned in position, reacting to threats that were not real, while the real threats moved against them from angles they weren't watching. It was perhaps the most sophisticated integration of force ability and military strategy that had ever been attempted on this scale. And it was at the center of everything Sado was building toward. The Armada assembled, ship by ship, fleet by fleet, drawn from every corner of the Sith Empire. The invasion force that Sado had been planning took shape. Sith warriors boarded their transports and their warships. Dark side alchemists prepared their creations, the monstrous organic weapons that Sith sorcery could produce and that had no analog in anything the Republic military had ever encountered. Commanders received their target assignments and their tactical parameters. The hyperspace route that Jory Darrigan's navigation system had provided was loaded into every navicomputer in the fleet. And somewhere ahead of all of it, moving back toward a civilization that didn't know it was coming, the Darrigan siblings were almost home. The tracking device Sado had placed in their ship pulsed quietly in the dark of hyperspace, marking their path, guiding everything that followed. Odan Ur's visions, in these last days before the invasion, had become nearly constant. He sat in meditation in the room he used for such things, and the images came one after another with an urgency that felt different from anything he had experienced before. Fire, darkness. The architectural language he still could not name but now recognized, had been seeing for long enough that its shapes felt almost familiar. And something else now. Movement. A vast, coordinated movement. Something large and multiple and deliberate, sliding through the dark toward a destination It had spent a very long time preparing to reach. He went to the council again. He explained again. He was listened to again, with respect and consideration and the measured caution of Jedi Masters who balanced the evidence of Force visions against the stability of a republic that currently faced no visible threat from any direction. He walked out of the council chamber and returned to his room and sat in meditation and watched the visions continue. The Armada was moving. The great hyperspace war had not yet begun. That word, war, requires two sides to be aware of each other, and one side was still almost entirely unaware. But the chain of events was now fully in motion. 1,000 years of Sith patience, a century of Ragnos's careful architecture, a power struggle between two visions of the Empire's future, two lost explorers making the worst wrong turn in the history of navigation. One extraordinary mind seeing opportunity in catastrophe, a manufactured crisis, a stolen coronation, a tracking device in a ship's computer pulsing its quiet signal through the dark between the stars. All of it had accumulated to this moment. All of it was pointing in the same direction. The Sith Empire, hidden for a millennium, polished to a terrible brightness in its long isolation, was about to introduce itself to a galaxy that had forgotten it existed. And the galaxy was not ready, not for the fleets, not for the dark side power that would pour through those fleets, not for the illusions or the alchemy or the battle meditation or the precision of an attack that would hit everywhere at once and give nothing time to respond before the next wave arrived. Not for the sight of Sith warships appearing in orbit over Coruscant, over the Republic capital, over the world, at the center of civilization, arriving without warning from a direction that no patrol route covered and no intelligence network had flagged. The Jedi Order had spent thousands of years preparing for threats. It had catalogued what it knew of the dark side. It had trained generations of knights and masters in combat and diplomacy and the deep understanding of the Force. It had done everything that an organization built for protection can do to be ready for what it might need to protect against. But you cannot fully prepare for what you do not know exists. You cannot train against an enemy whose capabilities you have never seen. You cannot anticipate tactics that no living being in your civilization has ever witnessed. The Jedi Order was ready for every threat it had previously encountered. It was not ready for the Sith Empire. No one was. Out in the dark, the Armada moved. The tracking device pulsed. The meditation sphere was ready. The commanders knew their targets. The warriors were in position. The alchemical weapons waited in their containment fields. The hyperspace calculations had been checked and rechecked. Everything Sado had prepared was prepared. Everything he had planned was in place. Somewhere ahead of the fleet, the Daragon Trail stretched through hyperspace toward a galaxy that had been sleeping peacefully for 1,000 years, dreaming its comfortable dream of safety and order, and a darkness that had already been defeated. Jory Daragon arrived home first. She came out of hyperspace into Republic space shaking, barely holding herself together, processing in fragments the reality of what had happened to her and her brother, captured by beings she had never imagined existed, held in a cell beneath a world that felt wrong from the ground up, rescued by soldiers she didn't recognize, who spoke in a language she didn't understand, and moved with a purposefulness that seemed to have nothing to do with her specifically. She had followed because there was no alternative, and now she was back in Republic space with a story that no one was going to believe until they had no choice. Gav had not come with her. This is where the story of the Daragons becomes complicated. And complication is important here, because the simple version two lost explorers trigger a war, flattens something that deserves to be understood more fully. Gav had made a choice in the chaos of the escape. A choice that Jory had not been able to stop and had not fully understood in the moment. He had stayed behind, not captured, not lost. He had chosen to remain in Sith space, because something about what he had seen there had gotten into him in a way that the simple category of danger could not contain. He had been talking to Naga Sado, not for long, and not in a language they shared, but with the kind of communication that certain people and certain minds can manage across the barrier of language when the subject is sufficiently urgent. And what Sado had communicated to him in that strange exchange was a vision of something. Sado was good at showing people what he wanted them to see. He had shown Gav a version of the Sith Empire that looked like power and possibility, and a scale of civilization that made the Republic's already vast dimensions feel cramped by comparison. Sado had a gift for making the thing he wanted look like the thing you had always wanted. And Gav, who had spent his entire life wanting more than he had, was susceptible to it in ways that Jory was not. He would regret this. He would come to understand, too late, what Sado was actually doing with him and with the situation he had manufactured. But that understanding would come later. For now, Gav Daragon remained in Sith space, and Jory Daragon came home alone to a republic that had no idea what was behind her. On Coruscant, the bureaucratic mechanisms of the Republic turned over the matter of the Daragon incident with the slow gravity of institutions processing information they do not yet understand. Jory was interviewed. Her account was recorded. Questions were asked about the nature of the beings who had held her, the world where she had been kept, the appearance of the soldiers who had rescued her. The information she provided described something that did not fit into any existing category of the Republic's understanding of the galaxy. There were civilizations beyond the borders. There were always civilizations beyond the borders. Unexplored space was full of things that hadn't been found yet. But the scale of what Jory described, the sophistication, the age of the structures she had seen, the quality of the technology in evidence, the sheer size of what appeared to be a significant and established empire sitting right on the edge of Republic space, all of this landed with the kind of weight that institutions find difficult to process quickly. Odan-Ur, hearing about the Daragon incident through the channels available to a Jedi who paid attention to such things, felt the visions he had been receiving suddenly click into sharper focus. The architecture he had seen in his meditations, the structures he had not been able to name, the sky that was the color of dried blood. He understood now. He had been seeing Korriban. He had been seeing the Sith. He went to the council again, with Jory Daragon's account attached to his own visions, with something more concrete than impressions to offer. The council listened. The situation was assessed. It was decided that the Republic military and the Jedi Order would monitor the situation, that further intelligence would be gathered, that the nature of this apparent civilization would be investigated through appropriate channels before any conclusions were drawn. It was a reasonable response. It was the measured response of an institution designed to operate thoughtfully rather than reactively. It was also a response that assumed there was time. There was not time. Sado had given the Daragon siblings a reasonable head start back toward Republic space. Enough of a lead that they would arrive, be processed, be reported on, set the bureaucratic wheels turning. He wanted the information in circulation, He wanted the Republic distracted by the question of what Jory had seen and what it meant. A Republic asking questions about a mysterious civilization was a Republic slightly less focused on what its sensors were telling it at the borders. Then he gave the order. The Armada moved simultaneously, not sequentially, not in waves that could be tracked and anticipated and met as they arrived, one after another. Simultaneously, every ship, every fleet, every strike force pointed at every target, all of them crossing into Republic space at the same moment, all of them emerging from hyperspace at their destinations in a window of time so compressed that the Republic's communication network could not carry warnings from one world to another fast enough to matter. This was what the Daragon Trail had made possible, a hyperspace route with known coordinates and known timing, allowing every element of the invasion to be synchronized with a precision that no previous military operation in Sith history had achieved. Sado had spent months on this coordination, running the calculations himself, checking and adjusting and verifying that the timing held across every thread of the attack. When the moment came, the moment that Sado had spent years building toward and months preparing for, the moment that had begun in the throne room politics of a Sith succession crisis and been shaped by a blind hyperspace jump and a manufactured rescue operation and a false flag and a coronation and 1,000 quiet preparations in the Pardes, dark, it arrived all at once, everywhere at once, in every direction at once, from a position that no one had been watching because no one had known to watch it. The Great Hyperspace War had begun, and the dream that the Republic had been dreaming, the long, comfortable dream of a galaxy understood and managed and safe, ended in the same moment, everywhere, all at once, with the sudden and terrible intrusion of a reality that had been building for 1,000 years and had finally decided that it was done waiting. The first thing Coruscant knew about it was the light, not sunrise, not the ordinary light of a city world that never goes fully dark, whose towers glow at every hour with the accumulated illumination of trillions of lives being lived at every level from the surface to the upper atmosphere. This was a different light. It came from above, from orbit, from a direction that Coruscant was not in the habit of looking. It was the light of Sith warships dropping out of hyperspace in numbers that the orbital defense sensors had not been configured to expect, because no one had ever considered that those numbers might be necessary. The sensors registered the contact. The alarms followed, but slowly, in the way that alarms follow contact. When the contact itself is so far outside the expected parameters that the systems require a moment to confirm that what they are seeing is actually what they are seeing. And in that moment, that brief mechanical hesitation before the alarms, the Sith fleet was already moving into attack formations, already orienting itself toward the surface, already doing everything that a fleet does when it has completed the transit portion of its operation and is now beginning the part it came here for. Coruscant had defenses. Of course it had defenses. It was the capital of the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy, the world at the center of everything, the seat of the Supreme Chancellor and the Senate and the Jedi Council and every institution that the Republic had built over 25,000 years of continuous existence. It was defended by orbital platforms and a standing fleet and surface installations and a garrison that was composed of the best soldiers in the Republic military. None of this was inadequate by any reasonable measure. None of it had been designed for what was now descending on it. The defense of Coruscant began in the confusion that always accompanies the first moments of a surprise of this scale. Commanders who had been managing routine patrols and administrative matters minutes earlier were now receiving information that their training had technically prepared them for, but that their experience had never actually delivered. There is a difference between knowing that a thing can happen and having it happen, and the defenders of Coruscant were crossing that distance at speed while simultaneously trying to function as a coordinated military force. The Sith fleet pressed the advantage of that confusion with everything it had. Warships that had been traveling in hyperspace for long enough that their crews were ready, prepared, psychologically calibrated for what they were about to do, moved against a planetary defense that was still processing the reality of their existence. The first volleys struck the orbital platforms before counterfire could be fully organized. The platforms responded because they were well made and their operators were trained, but the response was reactive, where the attack was deliberate. And reactive and deliberate are not evenly matched. And then the second layer of the attack arrived. And it was this layer that truly changed the nature of the battle. Naga Sadow was not on Coruscant. He was nowhere near Coruscant. He was in his meditation sphere, the specially constructed vessel built for exactly this purpose. Positioned at a distance from the actual fighting that kept him safe from every conventional threat. The meditation sphere itself was a marvel of Sith alchemy and engineering. A vessel that had been designed not as a weapon, but as an instrument of perception and projection. A machine that enhanced what Sadow could do with the Force to an extent that would not have been possible through pure ability alone. Its hull was woven through with materials that the Sith alchemists had treated for months, embedding dark side energy into the physical structure of the ship until the vessel itself functioned almost as a prosthesis for Force ability, extending and amplifying what Sadow reached out with, rather than merely containing it. From inside that sphere, Sadow closed his eyes and reached out across the distance to where his fleet was fighting, and he began to build. What the defenders of Coruscant saw when the second layer of the attack materialized was ships. More ships. Ships that had not been in the initial contact, that appeared on sensors with the full signature of real vessels, that moved in patterns consistent with tactical reinforcement, that deployed in positions that made sense for a fleet that had just landed its first blow and was now expanding its assault perimeter. The orbital defense commanders saw the numbers climbing and felt the shift from manageable crisis to something larger. And they responded the way that military training says to respond, by concentrating fire and calling for reinforcements and making the tactical adjustments that the situation seemed to demand. They were fighting phantoms. More than half of what they were seeing existed only because Sadow was maintaining it from inside his meditation sphere, drawing on the amplified force connection the vessel provided to project detailed and convincing illusions across an entire theater of battle. The ships were not there. The weapons fire was not there. The tactical movements were not there. The sensors were reading them because Sadow had made the illusions detailed enough to generate false sensor signatures, a refinement of battle meditation that took the technique into territory it had rarely been pushed into before. He had practiced this. He had spent months in the meditation sphere before the invasion, learning exactly how much detail was required to fool the Republic's sensor equipment, calibrating his projections to produce readings that would be indistinguishable from the real thing. It was not easy. Maintaining illusions across an entire planetary defense grid required a quality of concentration that tested even his considerable ability. But he had been training for this specifically, and in the early stages of the battle, before anything had happened to break that concentration, the technique worked exactly as he had designed it to. The effect on the defense of Coruscant was profound. Commanders trying to coordinate a response against a fleet of a given size were actually coordinating against a fleet that was significantly smaller. But they did not know that, so they made decisions appropriate to the larger number. Fire that could have concentrated on real targets was dispersed against phantom ones. Reinforcements were called from positions they were actually needed in to respond to threats that did not exist. The defensive calculations were simply wrong because the information they were based on was wrong, and there was no way from the receiving end to tell the difference. Panic, too, has its own weight on a battlefield, and the sight of a fleet of that apparent size over the capital of the Republic carried a psychological impact that was independent of anything it actually did. The population of Coruscant was not a military population in the sense of being trained for combat, but it was an intelligent population with access to information, and the information it was receiving in those early moments of the attack was that something enormous and dark and powerful was in orbit over their world, that the defense was engaged and struggling, that the situation was developing faster than anyone had anticipated. Fear moved through the city world the way fire moves through connected structures, feeding itself on the communication networks that were supposed to keep people informed. But Coruscant had its Jedi. Odan-Ur had been waiting for this. Not waiting with the particular relief of someone whose warnings have finally been vindicated, though there was perhaps an element of that in his mind. The quiet and not entirely comfortable awareness that the visions he had been dismissed over had turned out to be exactly what he said they were. He had been waiting in the more practical sense of someone who has been expecting a crisis and has used the time to think carefully about what to do when it arrives. He worked alongside Mehmet Nadil, another Jedi present on Coruscant. At the moment the attack began, a master whose capabilities complemented Odan-Ur's in ways that the particular demands of this battle would turn out to require. Between the two of them, they moved through the chaos of the early engagement with a speed and a sense of priority that came from not being surprised. When everyone around them was still processing the shock of the attack's existence, Odan-Ur and Mehmet Nadil were already at work. Odan-Ur did something that seems almost simple when described after the fact, but that required extraordinary clarity of mind to do in the conditions he was operating in. He looked at the battle as a whole rather than at its individual components. He perceived, through the Force, the shape of what was being done to the defenders of Coruscant, the way the resistance was being distributed across threats that were not evenly real, the strange quality of the numbers that did not quite add up in the way that numbers should when you were looking at a genuine military engagement. Something about the attack was wrong in a way he could not immediately name but could feel, a texture to it that did not match the texture of a straightforward assault. He meditated. In the middle of a battle, with the sounds of an orbital engagement filtering down through the layers of the city world, and the Force around him, churning with the collective fear of trillions of beings, he found the stillness he needed, and he looked. What he found, when he looked carefully enough, was Sadow's technique from the inside. The illusions had depth and detail, but they were sustained from a point, from a single, concentrated source, rather than from the individual reality of each ship he was seeing. A real fleet generates a real Force presence, the combined presence of thousands of individual beings aboard each vessel, and that combined presence has a particular quality to it. The Phantom Fleet generated no such presence. It was a surface without interior, an image without the substance that images of real things carry in the Force. He understood. And the understanding was not small. He communicated what he had found to Mehmet Nadil, and through the networks available to them, to the military commanders who needed the information most urgently. The communication was not instant. Nothing is instant in the middle of a battle. When the communication systems are being jammed, and the people you need to reach are each managing their own fragments of a very large crisis. But it moved from Odan-Ur outward, carried by every channel available, and it began to change the way the defense of Coruscant understood what it was fighting. The planetary defense forces could not immediately confirm what the Jedi were telling them. The sensors still showed the Phantom ships. The sensor readings still showed weapons fire from positions in space where nothing actually was. But when the commanders began to look at the battle with Odan-Ur's interpretation in mind, some things began to make a different kind of sense. The real Sith ships, separated from the Phantoms by the quality of Force presence Odan-Ur had described, could be identified, at least approximately, by Jedi working in coordination with the defense grid. Fire could be concentrated. Resources could be redistributed. The battle could begin to be fought against what was actually there. It was not a clean transition. People died in the process of making it. As people die in every transition, in every battle, the Sith fleet, even without the illusions, was a real and substantial military force, and it was fighting with the confidence and the capability of a military that had spent 1,000 years preparing for exactly this. Sith warriors were on the surface of Coruscant within the first hours of the engagement, brought down through gaps in the defense that the illusory confusion had opened. The fighting moved through corridors and across landing pads and down into the lower levels of the city world in the ugly close-quarters way that urban combat always does, without the clarity or the distance that make military engagements feel manageable from a distance. Odan-Ur was in the middle of it, not because he was the greatest combat Jedi of his generation, which he was not, but because the kind of battle that was being fought required the specific thing he was best at. Seeing what was actually happening rather than what the enemy wanted you to think was happening, he moved through the chaos of the Coruscant defense, and he kept looking, kept reaching out through the Force and checking his understanding against what he found there, kept passing information to the commanders and the Jedi who were making the 1,000 small decisions that a defense in real time requires. Mehmet Nadil fought beside him and around him, and the two of them together were more than either was separately, which is the thing about the right people finding each other at the right moment that makes certain partnerships worth remembering long after both parties are gone. The defense of Coruscant held, not easily, not without cost, not without moments when the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the margin felt narrower than anyone would have liked. But it held. And across the planet world, as the hours of the engagement stretched out and the initial shock of the attack converted itself into the grinding endurance of sustained defense, something shifted. The panic that had moved through the population in the first moments began to convert, slowly and unevenly, into something else. The Jedi were fighting. The military was fighting. Coruscant was fighting. The city world that had never truly been tested in this way was discovering in real time what it was made of. On Corus Major, which would one day bear a different name in honor of what happened here. The situation was different in its particulars, but similar in its essential character. A Sith fleet had arrived in the system without warning and begun its assault on a world that was neither expecting it nor prepared for the scale of what descended on it. The forces Sado had allocated to the Koros front were sufficient to overwhelm the system's normal defensive capabilities several times over, even without the illusions, and the illusions made the apparent scale of the attack genuinely terrifying. But Koros Major had something that not every world in the Republic could say it had at that particular moment. It had Empress Teta. She was young for a ruler of her stature, though she carried herself with a quality of authority that made her age feel irrelevant when you were in the same room with her. She had united the 7 worlds of the Koros system through a combination of military force and genuine political talent, the kind of personal capability that occasionally produces figures who are simply better at the business of leadership than the people around them can quite explain. Her system was prosperous and stable and governed with a directness that her people recognized and responded to, and that quality of connection between ruler and governed turned out to matter considerably when the Sith arrived and began to burn things. She did not retreat. She did not wait for Republic assistance to arrive from elsewhere, though she requested it and had every right to expect it. She moved to where the fighting was, and she led, which is both simpler and rarer than it sounds. Her personal presence in the defense of her world communicated something to every soldier and every civilian who saw her that orders and battle plans cannot communicate, the basic information that the person at the top believes this is survivable and is willing to stake their own life on that belief. The Jedi who were present in the Koros system fought beside her forces, and the combination of Empress Teta's determined ground defense and Jedi coordination of the system's naval resources produced a resistance that was considerably more effective than the Sith commanders assaulting the system had anticipated. Sith battle plans, like all battle plans, had been built on assumptions about how the target would respond, and the target was not responding entirely according to assumption. On Kirik, the violence was different in texture. The Sith forces that descended on that world brought with them the products of Sith alchemy that made the battles in that system unlike almost anything else in the war. Dark side alchemy could produce things that had no natural analog, creatures shaped by the Force and the will of their creators into forms that served specific purposes, things that were alive in the technical sense, while being entirely controlled by the intent that had made them. These creations moved through the defenses of Kirik in ways that conventional weapons handled poorly and that required Jedi to neutralize effectively, because the Force that had made them responded to the Force used against them in ways that conventional military force simply could not replicate. The defenders of Kirik held too, but at cost, and the nature of what they faced left a mark on the people who survived it that did not fade quickly. Across every front, in every system the Sith fleet had struck simultaneously. The pattern of the first phase of the war was the same in its broad outline. The initial shock of the attack, the disorientation of facing an enemy whose capabilities no one had properly prepared for, the slow conversion of panic into resistance, and then the grinding, costly, deeply uncertain business of actually fighting a war against something that had spent 1,000 years preparing for it. The Jedi Order as a whole mobilized with a speed that was itself remarkable. The Masters of the Council, operating from Coruscant in conditions that would have broken the concentration of less disciplined minds, coordinated the deployment of Jedi to the fronts that needed them most, making the triage decisions that the scale of a simultaneous multi-system engagement required. Which worlds could hold without Jedi support? Which could not? Where a single Jedi Master would make the critical difference, and where a dozen would not be enough. These were not easy calculations, and they were being made in real time with incomplete information. And the people making them knew that being wrong had consequences that could not be undone. Individual Jedi across every theater of the war were discovering the same thing that Odan-Ur had been the first to articulate clearly. The Sith fought differently from anything in the Jedi tradition's experience. Not merely tactically, though the tactics were genuinely different. Philosophically, the Sith understanding of the Force produced techniques and approaches that had no mirror in Jedi training. Because the Jedi had spent centuries carefully not exploring the aspects of the Force that produced those techniques. The dark side, weaponized by practitioners who had spent generations doing nothing but refining its use, expressed itself in ways that a Jedi encountering it for the first time had to adapt to quickly or not survive. Most adapted. The Jedi Order had always prided itself on producing practitioners of genuine capability, and genuine capability includes the ability to function in conditions you did not specifically train for. The Jedi who encountered Sith sorcery and dark side alchemy and battle meditation for the first time in a live combat context figured out, through the painful and irreversible method of actual experience, how to work against it. They learned that the Force connection underlying every Sith technique was still the Force, still something they knew, even if it was being used in ways they hadn't seen. They learned that Sith illusions had texture if you looked for it, that dark side creatures responded to Force calming as well as Force aggression, that Sith Lords who could generate enormous power could be disrupted by disrupting their concentration rather than matching their power directly. They learned. And the learning cost them. But it was happening. Gav Daragon was learning something else entirely. He had stayed in Sith space because Sado had given him something that had felt, at the time, like vision, like the expansion of a previously limited perspective. He had seen the Sith Empire in the form that Sado was so skilled at presenting it, as something vast and ancient and powerful, as the kind of civilization that a person who had spent their entire life operating on the margins of a different civilization might respond to with something approaching awe. He had heard Sado's arguments for why the Republic was not what it presented itself as, why the Jedi Order was a constraint rather than a protection, why the galaxy's future lay with the kind of strength and directness that the Sith represented rather than the cautious diplomacy and slow deliberation of Republic governance. He had believed enough of it to stay. He had not believed all of it. The part of him that was still Gav Daragon. Still, the person who had grown up in the Republic and breathed its assumptions and been shaped by its particular understanding of what was right. That part had not entirely gone away. It had gone quiet. It had been impressed into temporary submission by the scale of what surrounded him and the compelling intensity of Sado's persuasion. But it had not gone away. He watched the war from his position in Sith space, receiving information about the invasion's progress through the channels available to someone Sado had brought into his confidence. He heard about the strikes on Coruscant, on Koros, on Kirek, and the other worlds simultaneously assaulted. He processed the information through a mind that was trying to hold two incompatible frameworks at once. The Sith framing in which this was justice and expansion, and the claiming of what the Sith deserved, and the older framing in which this was his home. Those were his people dying on those worlds. Those were the cities he had moved through, the systems he had navigated, the civilization that had made him who he was. Whatever Sado thought it was worth. The gap between the two frameworks widened as the reports continued. Sado described the invasion as proceeding according to plan. And in its early phase it was. But the details of what proceeding according to plan meant, the specifics of what was being done to worlds and to the people on them, were not abstractions. They were real things that Gav could picture with the precision of someone who had actually been to those places and knew what they looked like and who lived there. He began to think about what he could do. This was not a simple thought. What a person in Gav Daragon's position could do, practically speaking, was very limited. He was in Sith space. He had no ship of his own. He had no weapon of any real consequence. He was a hyperspace scout, not a soldier, not a Jedi, not anyone with formal training in the specific kind of intervention that the situation seemed to require. What he had was a location and an understanding of what that location meant, because Sado, who had made the mistake of trusting him enough to keep him informed, had made sure that Gav knew where the meditation sphere was, knew approximately how the battle meditation worked, understood enough of the mechanics of what Sado was doing to understand what interrupting it would mean. If the illusions broke, the Republic would see the real size of the Sith fleet. If the Republic saw the real size of the Sith fleet, they would know the battle could be won. Everything Sado had built on the foundation of those phantom ships, the panic and the overextension of defensive resources and the psychological weight of facing an apparently overwhelming force, would collapse if the reality behind it became visible. The entire careful architecture of the invasion's psychological dimension would come apart the moment the defenders understood that the enemy was not what it had appeared to be. Gav Daragon made his decision, whether it was calculated or desperate, or some combination of both that he could not have cleanly separated even in the moment he was making it, is a question that his own later accounts do not definitively resolve. He moved toward the meditation sphere with no plan more sophisticated than reaching it. And he went alone. And he went without telling anyone what he intended, because there was no one in Sith space whose interests aligned with his in the way that would have made telling them useful. He found Sado in a state of profound concentration. The meditation required to maintain illusions across multiple simultaneous battlefields, while also coordinating the tactical elements of the invasion through battle meditation, was a demand that consumed Sado's full attention. It had to. You cannot do what Sado was doing and simultaneously monitor your immediate environment with the alertness that might have caught an uninvited presence approaching from the wrong direction. The concentration that made the technique possible was also what made him vulnerable to interruption. Gav interrupted him. The precise mechanism of the interruption, exactly what Gav did and how Sado responded in the first moments, is something that the historical record describes in general terms rather than specific detail. What is clear is that the disruption was sufficient. Sado's concentration broke, not completely, not permanently, but in the way that a held breath breaks when something unexpected strikes, a sharp inhalation, a loss of control over the thing being sustained. The battle meditation wavered, and when the battle meditation wavered, the illusions that depended on its precise and continuous maintenance began to fail. Across every battlefield simultaneously, Sith ships vanished. It was not a gradual process. It was not the slow dissolution that might have allowed the defenders to adjust gradually to a new understanding of the situation. It happened at once, in the sudden and absolute way that illusions always end when their sustaining concentration disappears. A moment when one thing was there, and the next moment, it was not, leaving only the empty space where it had appeared to be, and the sudden recalibrating shock of sensors that had been tracking signatures now reading nothing. The orbital defense commanders over Coruscant, over Koros, over Kirak, over every world where Sith ships had seemed to fill the sky in impossible numbers, stared at their displays and watched the numbers fall, watched targets disappear from tactical maps, watched the engagement, which had felt like fighting a tide, abruptly reveal itself as something significantly smaller. Real ships were still there. Real Sith warships with real crews were still very much engaged and very much dangerous. But they were the actual number, not the inflated one. And the actual number was something that the Republic defenses had the capacity to fight. The information moved through the Republic communication networks faster than anything else had moved since the first alarm. You cannot keep the vanishing of most of your enemy's apparent fleet private on a battlefield where thousands of people are simultaneously watching the same tactical displays. It spread across every front, through every channel, carried by the voices and the comms and the urgent transmissions of defenders who had been fighting a war that felt unwinnable and who were now being shown that it might not be. Morale is not a simple thing. It is not a number that goes up and down on a clean curve. It is the aggregate of what thousands or millions of people believe simultaneously about whether what they are doing matters and whether they can succeed. And it can shift with a speed that surprises even the people experiencing it when the right information arrives in the right moment. The right information in this moment was that the enemy had been bluffing, and that the bluff had been called, and that the defense of the Republic was more viable than it had appeared to be 45 minutes ago. The Republic forces across every front reorganized themselves around the new reality with a speed that reflected how well trained they actually were beneath the initial shock of the invasion. Commanders who had been making defensive calculations based on wrong numbers now made them based on right ones, and the right numbers suggested offensive possibilities that the wrong numbers had not. The Jedi, whose understanding of the Force made them better placed than anyone to appreciate the significance of what had just happened and why, reinforced the momentum of the shift with their presence in the places where presence mattered most. Empress Teta pressed the Koros front with everything she had the moment the numbers changed, because she was the kind of person who understood instinctively when a door had opened and did not wait for someone else to walk through it. Her forces, which had been holding with tremendous effort and significant cost, converted from defensive to offensive with the directness of a military led by someone who had decided that decisiveness in this moment was the thing that mattered more than anything else. On every front, the same conversion was happening at different speeds and with different textures, but in the same direction. The Republic was no longer simply trying to survive the invasion. It was beginning to win. Naga Sado felt the change through the Force before any report reached him. You do not spend as much time as he had spent connected to the living currents of a multi-front battle without developing a sensitivity to shifts in its character. And the shift that moved through the Force in the moment his concentration broke had a quality to it that was unmistakable. He had been the dominant current. He had been the thing that shaped the flow of everything around him, directing it, sustaining it, keeping the architecture of the invasion intact through the particular quality of his will. And now that current was gone, and in its place was something moving in the opposite direction, with a momentum that the Force communicated very clearly. He had lost the initiative. He had not yet lost the war. But the margin between those two conditions was narrowing faster than he could comfortably process. The retreat was ordered. Not a routing, not a collapse, but a strategic withdrawal of the kind that competent military leadership orders when the conditions that justified an advance have changed sufficiently to make continued advance inadvisable. Sado was not a man who indulged in the Sith weakness of allowing pride to override calculation. He could see what was happening, and he understood what it meant. And what it meant was that the invasion, as designed, had failed in its critical psychological dimension, and that a different approach was now required. His fleets began to consolidate, pulling back from the most extended positions toward formations that could make the transit back to Sith space in an organized manner. The fighting as they withdrew was intense in the way that fighting during withdrawal is always intense, both because the retreating force is trying to maintain enough cohesion to disengage cleanly, and because the advancing force is trying to prevent exactly that. The Sith military was well-trained and well-equipped, and did not collapse under pressure, which is the mark of a genuine army rather than a force that depends entirely on momentum and surprise. They withdrew in something approximating order, but the Republic was not going to let them withdraw cleanly. The Supreme Chancellor, receiving information about the shift in the battle with the same speed as everyone else, moved the Republic's strategic posture from reactive defense to active pursuit before the Sith fleets had completed their transit preparations. There was a logic to this that was harder to argue with than it might have been at other moments. The Sith Empire had attacked without warning. It had struck civilian worlds. It had caused destruction and death across dozens of systems simultaneously. Allowing it to retreat intact was not only militarily inadvisable, it was, in the political calculus of the Republic Senate and the judgment of the Jedi Council, simply unacceptable. The Republic fleet followed the retreating Sith warships back through hyperspace, following the same Darragon trail that the invasion had used to reach Republic space, now used in reverse by the people it had been designed to attack. It was a striking reversal. The route that Sado had spent so much careful effort constructing now serving as the path of his undoing, leading the consequences of the failed invasion directly back to the civilization that had launched it. Sado arrived in Sith space to find something he had not expected and had not planned for. Ludo Kresh was waiting for him. Kresh had not died. The destruction of his flagship during Sado's earlier political maneuvering had been spectacular enough and complete enough that most observers had concluded it was fatal, and most observers had concluded correctly by the standards of what they had seen. But most observers had not accounted for the particular quality of Ludo Kresh's survival instinct, which had been honed through decades of operating in an environment where the failure to escape a situation tended to produce permanent consequences. Kresh had escaped. Not comfortably, not without cost, but he had escaped, and he had gone into the shadows of Sith space with his surviving allies and waited. He had waited through the entire invasion, through the long weeks of the assault on the Republic, through the reports of Sado's initial success, and then the news of the failure, through the period when even Sado's most optimistic communications from the front were failing to conceal the fact that the tide had turned. Kresh had been watching all of it from a position outside Sado's sight, assembling the support he needed, rebuilding the faction he had been working to construct since before Ragnos died, and waiting for the exact moment when acting would be most effective. That moment was now. When Sado's damaged fleet dropped out of hyperspace in orbit over Korriban, expecting to find the Sith homeworlds intact, and under the control of the administration he had left in place, What he found instead was Kresh's fleet in formation across his approach vector. It was a masterpiece of timing. Sadow's forces were depleted from the invasion and the retreat and the sustained fighting of weeks of multi-front warfare. Kresh's forces had been resting and preparing, and were operating at full capacity. The disparity in combat effectiveness was significant, and both sides knew it. What followed was less a battle than a reckoning. Not because Sadow capitulated without fighting, because he did not. The Dark Lord of the Sith did not have surrender in his nature, and Kresh would not have accepted it in any case. But because the outcome, given the relative positions and conditions of the two fleets, was never genuinely uncertain for very long. Sith fought Sith in the skies of Korriban in a civil war that would have been devastating under any circumstances, and that was catastrophic under these ones. Because behind Sadow's fleet, closing fast along the Daragon Trail, was the Republic fleet that had followed the retreating Sith home. The Republic arrived to find a civil war. They did not stop to observe it. The scale of what happened next, when Republic military forces and Jedi together descended on a Sith empire that was simultaneously fighting itself and fighting a vastly larger external force, is difficult to render in terms that don't simply sound like numbers. Numbers cannot quite carry the weight of what the collapse of the Sith Empire actually was. You have to think about what was being destroyed. Not just military capability, not just ships and weapons and strategic assets, but a civilization. Cities that had stood on Ziost and Korriban and the other Sith worlds for thousands of years. Libraries containing knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of Sith scholarship, dark side research, and political philosophy and history and art, and everything that any civilization produces over the course of its existence. Temples whose architecture reflected a specific and coherent understanding of the relationship between power and the force that had no equivalent anywhere else in the galaxy. All of it burning, under attack by forces that had come here specifically to make sure it could not come back. The Republic military fought with the momentum of everything that had preceded this engagement, weeks of invasion and terror and cost and sacrifice that had converted itself into the particular kind of purposefulness that comes from knowing exactly what you are fighting against and why. The Jedi fought with a focused intensity that was somewhat unusual for an order that generally preferred resolution over destruction, but that the Council had determined was warranted by the scope and the character of what had been done to Republic worlds. The Sith civil war between Sadow and Kresh continued in the background of the larger assault, two factions of a dying civilization continuing to fight each other while a third party dismantled the foundations of everything both of them had been fighting over. The Sith Lords, who had followed Sadow, were killed in the fighting, or captured and subsequently executed, or scattered in small groups to whatever dark corner of the galaxy they could reach before the net closed around them. The Sith Lords who had followed Kresh fared no better. In the Republic's calculation, the question of which faction had which particular relationship with the invasion was not one that significantly affected the answer to the larger question of what to do with the Sith Empire as a whole. Ziost fell. The great towers that had caught no warmth from the distant sun came down in ruins, and the cold that was built into the stones of the Sith capital could no longer protect what the stones contained. Korriban, the sacred world, the burial ground of 1,000 years of Dark Lords, was invaded by Republic forces who moved through the Valley of the Dark Lords with a specific mission and the resources to execute it. The tombs were not opened. Some things the Republic and the Jedi were too careful or too afraid to disturb directly. But everything on the surface that was not buried was catalogued and seized or destroyed. Sith alchemical weapons were neutralized where they could be, destroyed where they could not. Creatures that had been made through dark side alchemy and that had survived the fighting in various states of containment were dealt with by Jedi, who did not enjoy the process, but understood its necessity. Libraries were seized, the volumes within them assessed by Jedi scholars, working quickly under conditions of considerable stress, those containing knowledge too dangerous to preserve, destroyed, those containing historical information the Order determined had value secured and transported. This was not a perfect process. It was not designed to be a perfect process. It was designed to be as thorough as possible in the time available. And thorough was what it was. The Sith military collapsed, not gradually, not with the kind of organized resistance that a functional military structure can sometimes maintain, even in the face of catastrophic defeat. It collapsed with the sudden completeness that comes when the organizational structure holding it together ceases to exist, when the chain of command has been severed at enough points that the remaining elements can no longer function as a coordinated force. Individual Sith warriors and small units fought on in the way that people fight when they have nothing left to retreat to. But the Empire as an entity, as a functioning civilization with coordinated military and political structure, was gone. The Great Hyperspace War was over, or what the Republic would call the Great Hyperspace War was over. What had actually been extinguished, and what had survived, were questions that the Republic would spend the next 1,000 years failing to answer correctly. Ludo Kresh, whose survival of Sado's earlier assassination attempt had shaped the entire endgame of the war, did not survive the Republic's counter-invasion. He had outlasted Sado's attempt to kill him. He had assembled sufficient force to confront the returning Dark Lord. He had demonstrated, across the arc of the whole conflict, the kind of patient and calculating intelligence that might have built something durable if he had operated in different conditions. He died in the fighting over Korriban, and his death completed the elimination of the Sith Empire's political leadership in a way that Sado's defeat alone would not have, because Sado was gone. He had seen the Republic fleet arrive. He had understood, with the clarity of a mind that was very good at reading military situations, exactly what it meant. The civil war with Kresh was no longer the primary consideration. The primary consideration was what happened to him personally in the next few hours. He was the Dark Lord of the Sith, which meant that if the Republic captured him, the subsequent course of events would not be one he could hope to influence in any direction that benefited him. He was also Naga Sado, which meant that he had always had an exit prepared. He fled with a small group of followers, moving through the chaos of the Republic assault and the ongoing civil war with a speed and a directness that reflected the focused single-mindedness of someone who has reduced their objective to a single achievable thing. Not victory, not revenge, survival. He headed for a world so distant and so unremarkable that no one had any particular reason to be watching it. A jungle moon circling a gas giant in a system that appeared on few maps and generated no traffic worth tracking. A moon called Yavin 4. He arrived and he descended into the dense vegetation that covered its surface like a living shroud, the kind of growth that goes from the ground to the canopy without gaps, and that makes the light into something filtered and green and directionless. He had followers, the small group who had managed to escape with him, and he had the Massassi. The Massassi were a people who had come with the Sith Empire. beings of Sith origin who had settled Yavin 4 in an earlier era and who still lived there in a state that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated civilization of the empire they had come from. Generations of isolation and the particular effects of extensive Sith alchemy had changed them, not destroyed them. They were still present, still capable, and they recognized in Sado the kind of power that their culture and their biology disposed them to respond to. He built temples. The construction was not incidental. The temples served purposes that went beyond shelter or ceremony. They were sites of Sith alchemy practice, locations where the dark side could be concentrated and worked with in ways the Jungle Moon's isolation made possible without interference. He built on Yavin 4 with the same careful purposefulness that had characterized his construction of the invasion, because Naga Sado was not, at any depth, a being who stopped planning simply because the immediate plan had failed. He conducted experiments. The Massassi served him, partly willingly and partly through the kind of compulsion that dark side power can create in those susceptible to it, and in serving they provided him with the living material that Sith alchemy experiments require. This is one of the darker passages of what happened on Yavin 4. Not the darkest, but dark enough that the Sith oral tradition tends to acknowledge it more obliquely than directly. The Massassi who went into some of those experiments were not the same afterward, in the ways that matter, eventually, in the way that all things eventually. He prepared for something that required more time than he currently had available. He had used Sith alchemy to extend his life far beyond what natural lifespan would have permitted. But natural lifespan and extended lifespan are both still finite, and the project he had in mind was not something that finite time could complete. The specific form that Sith preservation took, in his case, involved a Sith meditative process of extraordinary depth. A retreat inward that the body follows slowly, a kind of deliberate deceleration of all biological processes to something that could be sustained indefinitely by the dark side energy present in and around the temples he had built. He went into that stillness. He left behind the jungle and the green filtered light and the sounds of the living world that continued around him. And he went somewhere inside himself that was also, in the specific way the dark side makes certain things possible, outside of ordinary time. The temples continued to radiate dark energy. The Massassi continued to occupy the moon, shaped by generations of his influence into something that bore his mark. And on Yavin 4, in the depths of a structure he had built with the same hands that had once built an invasion fleet, Naga Sado waited for what he may not have entirely known, for the future he had wanted and could not yet reach, for someone to find him, or for conditions to change, or for time to produce opportunities that the present moment did not offer. For the thing that the dark side always waits for, because the dark side is patient in a way that the light side sometimes struggles to match, patient and certain and willing to wait as long as necessary. Back in Republic space, the aftermath of the war was being processed through every institution the Republic possessed. The Senate debated and memorialized and allocated resources to the rebuilding of worlds that had been damaged by the invasion. The military filed its reports and counted its losses and reorganized itself around the lessons of the conflict, though the lesson that perhaps most needed to be absorbed, that threats could come from directions no one was watching, tended to be absorbed less thoroughly than it deserved. Institutional memory is not the same as institutional change. and the Republic was very large and had a great deal of momentum in the direction it had already been moving. The Jedi Order undertook a task that was in some ways the most significant consequence of the war, and that would shape the nature of what threats the galaxy faced for the next several hundred years. It undertook the systematic collection and suppression of Sith knowledge. This was not a small project. The war had shown the Order, in the most direct possible terms, what a civilization built on dark side mastery could do, and the Jedi who had fought in it came back with a very clear sense of what they wanted to prevent from ever being possible again. The dark side techniques they had encountered, the battle meditation and the alchemy, and the sorcery, and the specific forms of force manipulation that the Sith had developed over their millennium of isolated practice, were things that the Order did not want to see again. The most direct way to prevent seeing them again was to make sure that the knowledge required to develop them was not available. Teams of Jedi were dispatched across Republic space with the specific task of finding everything that could be found of Sith knowledge and either securing it or destroying it. Holocrons recovered from the battlefields of the war, artifacts salvaged from Sith sites on worlds that had been attacked, documents and records of every kind that bore the mark of Sith origin. They were collected with thoroughness, assessed by scholars with the specific expertise the assessment required, and dealt with according to the Order's determination of what each piece of knowledge represented in terms of danger. The destruction was considerable. The preservation, in sealed vaults with access restricted to those the Order deemed senior, enough to handle the knowledge responsibly, was also considerable. Whether the balance between those two choices was struck correctly is a question that scholars have argued about ever since. And it is not a question with a clean answer. You can say that the Jedi were too aggressive in their suppression, that knowledge destroyed is knowledge that cannot be learned from or understood or used defensively. You can also say that the knowledge they preserved was subsequently accessed by people who should not have had access to it, and that the vault approach failed in practice. What you cannot say is that the problem was simple, or that there was an obvious correct answer that the Order simply failed to choose. The Jedi also undertook something more personal. The Order had lost members in the war, not catastrophically, not in numbers that threatened the Order's continued existence, but in ways that marked every practitioner who survived, and that left absences in the Force that other Jedi felt the way you feel. A gap in something that should be whole. This kind of loss produces a particular quality of reflection in a tradition as old as the Jedi, a renewed attention to what the Order is for, and what it costs to be what it is, and what that cost means when you believe in what you are doing and when you find yourself uncertain about parts of it. The war had raised questions about the limits of Jedi preparation. The Order had spent centuries training against threats it understood, and the Sith had shown that it did not understand everything. This was not comfortable knowledge for an institution that was also the galaxy's primary source of moral and philosophical authority. The Jedi were supposed to see clearly. They were supposed to understand the Force in its depths. And they had been completely surprised by something that had been sitting in the dark for 1,000 years, getting ready to attack them. Odan-Ur became an important figure in this period of reflection and rebuilding. He had been right. And the record of his having been right was not something that was quietly set aside. He wrote extensively in the aftermath of the war, and his writing had the quality that first-hand accounts of significant events sometimes produce, the particular clarity of someone who has thought carefully about what they saw and lived through, and who is not yet removed enough from it to have smoothed away the parts that do not fit neatly into the preferred narrative. He wrote about the nature of the Sith, not as a simple evil, not as a monolithic darkness, but as a genuine philosophical tradition that had developed in isolation to a point of extraordinary sophistication and that deserved to be understood on its own terms, even when what was understood made it necessary to oppose it. He wrote about what the war had revealed, about the limits of the Republic's self-knowledge, the comfortable assumptions that the absence of visible threat tends to generate, and that the presence of an actual threat dissolves with a speed that should perhaps tell you something about how solid those assumptions ever were. He wrote about the Force as something larger than either the Jedi or the Sith, something that was not fully understood by either tradition, and that both traditions, in their different ways, were reaching toward through the specific lens of their specific historical experience. The writings of Odan produced in the years after the Great Hyperspace War, would go on to be studied by Jedi for generations. They were not comfortable reading. They did not offer the reassurance that difficulty has been acknowledged and dealt with and will not recur. They offered something less satisfying and more durable: the sustained attention of a mind that had seen something important and was determined to understand it rather than simply to survive it. The Republic, for its part, produced the more official version of what the war meant. Monuments were built, commemorations were established, the names of worlds that had been defended successfully were honored, and Koros Major was renamed the Empress Teta system in acknowledgement of the specific and personal courage that its ruler had demonstrated in circumstances where personal courage had made a concrete difference. The Daragon siblings were remembered, though in a complicated way, as the accidental catalysts of a war that had been building for 1,000 years, and that would have found some other ignition point if they had not provided it. Jory more sympathetically than Gav, for reasons that the historical record makes understandable, if not entirely fair to Gav's own complicated arc. The official version said that the war had been fought and won, that the Sith Empire had been destroyed, that the threat was over, and while vigilance remained important, the specific danger posed by the ancient civilization in the dark had been permanently removed. This was what the monuments said. This was what the Senate commemorations said. This was what the official history recorded. And it was the version that most people in the Republic believed for the next several centuries, during which the belief was largely not tested in ways that required revision. It was not entirely true. There were the survivors who had scattered into the outer reaches, small groups of Sith or half-Sith or Force-sensitive individuals who had absorbed enough of the tradition to carry pieces of it forward in hiding. There was Sado himself, lying in his dark stillness under the canopy of Yavin 4, neither truly dead nor truly living by any measure that ordinary biology applies. There were the Masasi, shaped by his influence into guardians of a site that continued to radiate dark energy in ways that the Force-sensitive could feel from considerable distances if they knew what they were feeling for. And there was something that the Republic and the Jedi did not know about because they had never known about it. Something that had made a deliberate choice during the war to remain uninvolved, to watch from a safe distance while the Sith Empire that Ragnos had built and Sado had squandered burned in the fires of its own overreach, and the Republic's counterattack. Something that had sat on a world called Nathema and waited with the particular patience of a mind that thought in timescales that made the entire duration of the Great Hyperspace War look like an afternoon. His contemporaries in the Sith court had called him Tenebrae. He had called himself Vitiate. He had been a child of extraordinary and terrifying ability who had risen to the title of Sith Lord through methods that the most seasoned Sith Lord in the Empire had found impressive enough to reward and quietly disturbing enough not to look at too closely. He had not gone to war with the Republic because going to war with the Republic at that moment, with those forces, under that leadership, had looked to him like exactly what it turned out to be. A catastrophic overextension by an ambitious commander who had allowed his desire for conquest to override his assessment of the risks. Vitiate watched the Sith Empire collapse. He watched Sado retreat to Yavin 4. He watched the Republic celebrate its victory and declare the threat eliminated. And he began, quietly and systematically, and with the patience that was perhaps his most distinctive characteristic, to build something new. He would not make Sado's mistakes. He would not be in a hurry. He would not allow ambition to override calculation. He would not launch his war before the preparations for it were complete, and completing those preparations would take time. Not years, not decades, centuries, possibly more. He gathered survivors. Not many, not at first, because not many were available, and because the size of what he was assembling in this early stage was not the thing that mattered. What mattered was the quality of it, the specific character of the people, and the knowledge and the resources he was drawing together. He found a world that the Republic's charts did not contain, and that was far enough from any established hyperspace route that stumbling across it by accident was essentially impossible. He called that world Dromund Kaas. On Dromund Kaas, in the permanent storm that rolled across its skies, as though the planet itself was generating weather to match what was building inside it, Vitiate began the long project of constructing the thing that would eventually make the Great Hyperspace War look like a preliminary encounter. The Republic did not know. There was no particular reason the Republic should have known. They had done everything that a victorious civilization does after eliminating a threat. They had destroyed the infrastructure of the enemy. They had suppressed the knowledge that made the enemy dangerous. They had rebuilt what the war had damaged and memorialized what it had cost, and continued expanding and prospering in the way that civilizations do when the immediate danger is past. The threat was not past. It had gone underground. It had gone so far underground that the people looking for it could not find it because they were looking in the right places for the wrong thing. They were looking for Sith, for the red-skinned descendants of the original exile, for the dark side traditions that the war had made recognizable, for the specific form that the threat had taken when it introduced itself. The thing that was growing on Dromund Kaas was something that had learned from the way the previous version had ended, and it would not take the same form. It would be different, more patient, more careful, more ruthlessly focused on the single objective that Vitiate had decided everything else would serve. But that is a different story, for a different time. That story belongs to the centuries after the smoke cleared from Korriban and Ziost, after the Republic finished its monuments and its commemorations, and returned to the business of being a galaxy-spanning civilization at peace. That story begins in the silence that followed the Great Hyperspace War. In the space where the threat was supposed to be gone and wasn't, in the dark that the Republic had declared, cleared without ever having fully looked into it. The Great Hyperspace War ended. The Republic had won. The Sith Empire was destroyed. These things were true. But wars do not end because they stop being fought. They end when what made them necessary is genuinely resolved. And what made the Great Hyperspace War necessary was 1,000 years of exile and resentment, and the particular ferocity that comes from a tradition that believes strength is everything, and that has had a very long time to get strong, Destroying the buildings does not destroy the tradition. Executing the lords does not eliminate the philosophy. Suppressing the knowledge does not make the knowledge not exist, because knowledge that has existed in minds leaves traces even when the texts that contained it are burned. The cycle that the Great Hyperspace War was one iteration of did not end with the war. It compressed, it reorganized, it went underground and reconstituted itself in forms that the people looking for it were not looking for. The darkness that the Republic declared defeated simply moved to somewhere darker, where darkness tends to do quite well and where the light, being not quite sufficient to reach, could not follow. Odan-Ur, who would live for an extraordinarily long time by the standards of most species, and who would therefore have the somewhat grim privilege of watching some of what followed, wrote in his later years about what he believed the Great Hyperspace War had actually meant. Not what it had been declared to mean in the official accounts, what it had actually meant in the larger shape of things. He wrote that the war had shown the galaxy what it was dealing with. Not the specific form of the Sith Empire, which was gone, but the thing beneath the specific form. The capacity of the dark side to build and to wait, and to organize itself around a purpose, and to become, through long patience and deliberate practice, something that the light side had to treat seriously rather than dismissing as simply darkness opposing light. He wrote that the Jedi had learned in the Great Hyperspace War that the dark side was not merely the absence of the Force's better nature. It was a presence, a teacher, a tradition with its own coherence and its own accumulated wisdom, however terrible the uses to which that wisdom was put. He wrote that the Republic had learned, or should have learned, that the edges of the known galaxy were not the edges of the real galaxy, and that the comfortable assumption of understanding your situation completely was the specific vulnerability that patient and well-prepared enemies were designed to exploit. He wrote that the cost of the war had been real, and that the victory had been real, and that neither the cost nor the victory meant what it was being presented as meaning, because the war had not resolved anything. It had deferred things. It had pushed the confrontation between what the Republic represented and what the Sith Empire represented into the future, rather than settling it in the present. And the future was not an empty space where deferred things waited patiently in place. It was an active place where deferred things grew and changed and prepared themselves to be less deferrable next time. He wrote all of this, and it was read and discussed and filed carefully in the archives where serious scholarship goes. And the Republic continued doing what the Republic did, and the darkness on Dromund Kaas continued building what it was building. And the galaxy turned in the silence that follows a war and mistakes for peace. The Great Hyperspace War was over. What it had set in motion was not.